After the holidays, you open your fridge. You've got a mammoth task of what to do with all your leftover food. You start combining things in ways that maybe you shouldn't, and build things that wouldn't normally exist. That's kind of what this phone is, the Galaxy S23 FE, the leftovers phone. It's got an old chipset in it from a couple of years ago, crammed in a device that's pretty much identical to the Galaxy A54, but with a better display and a zoom camera. So why does this phone exist? It's not as good as the S23 series, and it isn't as cheap as the Galaxy A series. It's a weird in-between phone. I'm Cam Bunton from Pocket-lint, and I'm going to try and explain in this review. To make more sense of it, it's worth looking at the context of Samsung's phone range from 2023. If you want a flagship phone at a relatively reasonable price, that means going with the smallest Galaxy S23. But if you want a bigger screen, the price becomes not so reasonable, quickly approaching that $1,000 mark. Even now, nearly a year after launching, when I looked at pricing for this video, the price is still about $800 at least. In fact, approaching near the $900 mark, some retailers even still selling it for $1,000. So this is where the Galaxy S23 fits. It has the big 6.4-inch screen, just like the Galaxy S23 Plus, but it's under $600. Now, to get it down to that price, some compromises were made, and the most obvious, first of all, is in the design, because after all, the design is nigh on identical to the Galaxy A54, which is a much cheaper phone than Samsung's flagship range. From the front of the phone, it doesn't have those super skinny uniform bezels all the way around the display like the flagships do. It's one of the S23's most striking features visually. So it's obvious when you look at the S23 FE that it doesn't have those. That's not to say the bezels are really chunky, they're just more like what you'd expect in a cheaper phone, with the bottom bezel being thicker than the other three sides. Unlike the A54, however, the phone features an aluminium frame all the way around the edges. Samsung gave the phone a more durable build and feel than its budget series, and also made it more water and dust resistant. It's IP68 rated, just like the more expensive models. And the glass on the front and the back, well, that's more like the older flagships, or current mid-range devices. Seems like some old material left in the leftover bin found its way to this 2023 phone. It's Gorilla Glass 5, which at one point was the top version of Corning's tempered glass. But at which point exactly? Well, in 2016, when the Galaxy Note 7 launched. Oof. Now, to use, the phone feels pretty chunky and hefty, and that slippery glass on the back makes it a bit cumbersome and tricky to manage one-handed, and it'll happily slide off things without any encouragement. Large phones are pretty much the norm these days, but I'd advise getting a case or a skin just to stop that slippery feel. Now, what's interesting about the display is that it uses a very similar panel to what's in the flagship S23 models. It's the Samsung Dynamic AMOLED 2X, but a slightly older version that's not quite as good. It's still a very good display though, delivering a brighter, more vivid experience than what you'll find in the more affordable A-series models. It's actually brilliant for watching Netflix shows on, and even copes well with HDR content. Its peak brightness reaches as high as 1450 nits, which isn't all that much less than what the S23 offers, plus it can reach refresh rates up to 120 Hz. It has got a fingerprint sensor built into the display as well, and here is one area I wish Samsung had just gone with the same kind of sensor that's in the flagship models, because my experience with this has not been good. It took me about 10 or 11 times to go through the setup process to register my thumbprint, which isn't something I've experienced on any other phone, and I've tested many phones. And to unlock it, I found I had to be super specific about which part of my thumb I pressed down in order for it to unlock. If I wasn't purposeful, it'd fail. And when this happens multiple times a day, it can be pretty frustrating. As is typical, the phone is loaded with One UI baked on top of Android, and as always, it's loaded with lots of Samsung extras, which, like the other flagship models, includes DeX, but over a cable. This is the Samsung desktop-like interface, allowing you to use the phone like a computer of sorts while hooked up to an external monitor. Now, there's lots of bloat with Samsung software, and it's the one thing that stands in stark contrast to something like the Pixel 8 or even the Pixel 7a, and they both sit within about $100 of the S23 FE on either side of that price mark. Now, like I've mentioned, there's the odd bit of leftover hardware thrown in the mix with the S23 FE, and inside, when you go digging around in the components, you'd find either an Exynos 2200 or a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, depending on which market you're in. These two chips were launched in January 2022 with the Galaxy S21. Now, they're not bad chips, but also they were never the absolute best. Exynos, compared to flagship processors, tend to be a bit less efficient at managing temperature and also battery life. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 was replaced by the 8 Plus Gen 1 a few months after launching for similar reasons. Despite less than absolutely perfect performance, they're still powerful processors, and they're considerably better than the mid-range stuff you'll find in the Galaxy A series, especially when it comes to camera performance, which I'll get into later. The everyday experience of using the S23 FE is for the most part fast, smooth and responsive. It certainly doesn't feel like you're using a mid-range phone. It'll load your favourite games without too much trouble, and it doesn't seem to have any issues when it came to playing those games for an extended period either. Although it must be said, it's currently winter when I've been testing it, and so overheating was never going to be too much of a problem. Battery life is similarly strong, with the phone capable of giving about 8 hours of active use time on a full charge. Even relatively heavy phone users shouldn't struggle to get to the end of a long day. However, the surprising thing perhaps is that it doesn't seem to be all that different in performance from the regular S23, which has a smaller battery. A lot of that is likely down to the fact that it has a less efficient 2-year-old processor inside. And when it comes to refilling, you get 25-watt speed, which means it's not especially speedy to refill an empty battery. It's not especially slow either, however, giving you about 50% in 30 minutes. And it can charge wirelessly if you have a wireless charger. Now, the triple camera on the back, there's also a bit of a mishmash of parts here too. It's got a similar main and ultra-wide sensor to the S23 and S23 Plus, but with a lower resolution 3x telephoto zoom thrown into the mix. Now, combined with the power from the chipset inside, the results are actually pretty strong across the board from all 3 lenses. And while not completely perfect, the strength of the system is the versatility. The 3x optical zoom camera alongside the other 2 means you can take sharp, vibrant photos from all 3 cameras, switching between them without any serious inconsistencies, although the ultra-wide does seem to struggle a bit more in lower light situations. Now, because it has a flagship processor, albeit an old one, it does a good job of processing images quickly. It can elevate dark areas in the images and stop the shadows from becoming too dark and crushed, and evens out the highlights and shadows to produce color-rich, bright images, even in low-light situations. Images still have that typical Samsung tendency of being quite artificial looking. Colors aren't natural at all, giving that pop to photos that Samsung is known for. And sometimes I found areas of images where there were defined light and dark parts right next to each other, that line would look sort of painted with a brush, and not realistic, in terms of texture at least. That was mostly during night mode shots. Night mode is effective though, and only seems to take a second or 2 to capture the image. Video is just about okay. I had some issues with stabilization where when simply walking it would still have a noticeable jump at the end of every step. I asked why this phone exists at the beginning of this video, and I think the answer only really becomes clear when you compare it to the S23 Plus, or depending when you're watching this video, the S24 Plus. This is effectively about offering that big screen experience with a powerful fast processor at a price that's much cheaper than the plus-sized Galaxy S phones. That of course means compromises like raiding the spare parts bin or older components, but the experience is very much better than the Galaxy A series phones. It's definitely not quite as good as the Galaxy S Plus models, but crucially, it's only about $600 to buy. And if you want the best Samsung experience for that sort of money, and you need a bigger screen than the smallest older Galaxy S phones can offer, this is still your best bet. However, at this sort of money, I'd be tempted to get a Pixel, or just put up with a smaller screen and spend a little extra and get the 1-year-old Galaxy S23. Let me know what you think of the S23 FE. Does it need to exist? Shout out in the comments below, or you can get me on Threads. I'm at Cam Bunton. If you did like this video, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and tap the notification bell, and I'll see you again in the next one. Bye for now.